Hi, I'm Giles Martin, EVP of Strategy at Oxford Road, and we have a really special MRT episode for you this week with a special guest joining Dan. But before we get to that, I'm here to tell you about a new study that we are publishing this week, which you can download at oxfordroad.com/podcast election. You may have read about the podcast election, as it's been termed. And with the inauguration this week, we wanted to publish some analysis and some work that we had done relating to the election. You may have heard that Donald Trump's campaign reached, according to Edison Research, far many more listeners than Kamala Harris's campaign likely did. And obviously, that appears to have been a very key factor in the success of podcasts having an influence in these respective campaigns. But there's more to it than that. And that's what our study is about. And that's why we're publishing it this week. We really think that if you're interested in driving outcomes with podcasts, whether you're a political strategist, a brand strategist, a media planner, growth marketer, there's going to be something of interest in here for you. So please go to oxfordroad.com/podcast election, download our new study, and we would very much like to hear your feedback. So please contact us with any of that. And with that, I will hand it over to Dan for this week's MRT episode. Thank you.
Welcome to a very special edition to the Media Roundtable podcast. I'm your host, Dan Granger, and, we do this show for the advertising community, particularly those that care about the channel of podcasting and audio and are interested in partnering with voices that can really exchange ideas in a way that's different than what you get in other, short-form, clip-driven channels, which is pretty much everywhere else. We have somebody here who's been a transformative figure, not just in podcasting, but in media and in politics, and arguably the leading voice of the conservative movement for the last, 5 or so years, who seems to have taken the torch from probably Rush Limbaugh. A lot of people hate our guest, and a lot of people love our guest because he can be so polarizing. I'm talking about none other than Ben Shapiro. He doesn't really need an introduction, but he is co-founder and editor of The Daily Wire. He's also hosted The Ben Shapiro Show, which is the largest conservative podcast and radio show in the nation. He's got 8 nonfiction books. And we've been trying to get him to come have this conversation for a long time, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. We're going to talk about civility. We're going to talk about life in Trump 2, and how do we create a more sustainable ecosystem when everybody's at each other's throats, and how the rules are changing, and what should they be. I really think you're going to enjoy this conversation, and I hope it's challenging. We challenge each other, and I hope it challenges you too. Enjoy. Okay. All right. Well, welcome, Ben Shapiro. Finally, after all these years, we get to do a podcast together. So great thrill to have you here on the Media Roundtable podcast. Ben, one thing you may not know is that we started doing this podcast in 2020. And what had just happened was George Floyd. And it was during that time that advertisers, which is our main constituency here and the audience we make this to serve, they really got very confused very quickly about what type of media was safe to sponsor and what was not. And we started seeing a lot of decisions coming through to us very quickly. And what would happen is I had several advertisers pull off of your show, and I'd call them and I would say, well, what did he say? What did he do? And they would say, well, it's not so much what he said, it's just what he represents. And I felt like, okay, so clearly they're responding to something, but nobody really had a way of processing what that was or why it was. And what we decided to do was create a podcast as an open lab to kind of workshop the issue of what was going on in media and what media's role was in the polarization that we were seeing in 2020, and to try to figure out what do we do about it, particularly from the advertising community. And I think the problem's only compounded since then. So, inadvertently, you were a big part of what inspired us to start this conversation. And so I'm glad to have you hop in and be a part of it. I guess to start things off, when you look back, and you and I go back about 15 years, right? Even before the Ben Shapiro show. And, what would you say has changed since you first got into media about the state of media before we even get to the polarization piece?
I mean, obviously, media has become a lot more fragmented. There are many more sources of media. I would say that we went through a sort of arc in terms of how much media people were allowed to consume from different sources. There was a point back in, I would say, 2010, 2011, 2012, where it was pretty open. And then it seemed to be siphoned off between 2016 and 2024, essentially. And now you're starting to see it reopening again. Again, that's simplifying the issue a little bit. But I think that precisely because of what you were talking about, because of the rise of President Trump, or because of the multiplicity of very high-profile political things happening, there was an attempt by people who are at the heads of social media networks, people who are in the advertising business, people who are in government, to try and shut down dissemination of information, or at the very least not to involve themselves with dissemination of information, which led to a sort of reinforcement of a legacy media that had been dying and that really was in serious trouble. And I think you're starting to see that reopen now with, for example, Mark Zuckerberg talking about removing many of the limits with regard to dissemination of information. Obviously, a lot of that changed when Elon bought Twitter and renamed it X. And you're starting to see that, I think, in the advertising market as well, is a recognition that actually the American people are big boys and big girls and are capable of processing from multiple sources of information. And they are not going to blame advertisers if they disagree with the host upon which the advertising is appearing, particularly if that advertiser happens to advertise across a wide swath of viewpoints. And one of the things that happened, I think, in the period that you're talking about in 2020 was this sort of knee-jerk, HR-driven attempt by many of the middle managers at these businesses to avoid blame. They're really afraid that one day their 800 lines would just get inundated with people who are being astroturfed by a particular group, yelling at their customer service reps about how dare you advertise with X, Y, or Z show. And even though none of that actually materialized in sales, it was still enough that people didn't want to receive the blowback. And so they were scared. And so they preemptively decided to move out of the news sector entirely, or particular areas of the news sector. I think that was wrong-headed. I think that it was a risk-averse mentality. And I think it left a lot of money on the table, frankly, for advertisers, because, as we've talked about before, my show has a very, very large audience. If you decide that you are going to take a worse deal from a different podcast because you're afraid that you might get a couple of angry tweets, that's a bad business decision. And that business decision is not being driven really by business. It's really being driven by fear. And that's something that we at the Daily Wire have really been fighting against for years at this point. We've even imposed policies of our own with regard to the advertisers that we work with that take all of that into account.
So, you and I have had this discussion behind closed doors several times. And, I think we agree certainly on the problematic nature of the arbitrary way that the advertising community has been trying to deal with open ecosystems for free speech, right? And I think where there's a subtle possible difference that I want to get your perspective on is I feel that in my view, there was certainly a lot of overreach. There was certainly a lot of unnecessary stifling of conversation, which is bad for democracy as well as for advertisers that want to see, high performance. And we know that political-based media, news media, and conservative media all generally over-index in their performance for brands. But there's still a deeper challenge. And when you see media publishers kind of catering to whoever's in power at the moment. When it was Biden, you saw them shift to overly restrictive. Now, today we're seeing the pendulum swing back. And the challenge that I see is that there is still something fundamentally needed to govern what it is that tells an advertiser what type of environment they're falling in, to make sure that they can stay aligned to an extent with their brand values in terms of what types of voices they support. Do you see any need for accountability, or is your view that we should just have open ecosystem?
I'm more of an open ecosystem guy. I tend to think that if you run a business, right? We run a very large business here at Daily Wire. We get to decide with whom we are going to advertise or spend our money. And we make those decisions on a case-by-case basis. And what's astonishing to me is how few of these companies seem to do that. I mean, they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars, some of these companies, in advertising, and yet they're simply outsourcing these sorts of decisions to a third party. Like for a while, it was Global Alliance for Responsible Media, or they're outsourcing their opinions on particular news sources to NewsGuard or something like that. And to me, that it puzzles me as to why you would outsource something as important as marketing to a third party, unless essentially you're just creating a cartel. Right? And that was sort of, I think, the case with GARM, which was, okay, well, none of us will get a competitive advantage up on the other by actually doing our own homework and deciding to advertise with a conservative show and then outperforming you. Instead, we'll all sort of agree to collude with one another informally and not advertise with some of the high-performing shows. And that way, if none of us are doing it, then all of us are benefiting from not having to do any of this outsourced work. I think that that's a bad thing. I think that it was always doomed to failure. I think there was always going to be somebody who decided to break the mold. There was going to be some company that said, hey, hold up a second. There's a massive market hole and opportunity that I can take advantage of. And again, I think a lot of this originally was driven by oversensitivity, and then it was driven by a willingness to outsource, to do less work, to avoid risk. And I get all of that. Again, I think there's a difference between the founders' culture that creates a lot of these companies and the sort of management culture that caretakes a lot of these companies and is seeking to avoid blowback rather than expanding at the fastest possible rate. So it seems to me not all that difficult to challenge is the truth. When it comes to individual companies making individual decisions. If you are a large razor brand, right? We own a razor brand. If you're a razor brand, we decide, do we want to advertise with the UFC or do we not want to advertise with UFC? And we can do that on a case-by-case basis. And if somebody asks us why we're not advertising with somebody, we should be able to answer that question. We should be able to say, it's because this brand does not align with our values, and say that confidently, not just say that because we received a blowback tweet, but say that because the brand actually doesn't align with our values. Or we can say, listen, it's not a matter of brand alignment with our values. There's a panoply of speech that is within the Overton window. Our Overton window happens to have these boundaries. If it's outside that Overton window, we're not comfortable putting our advertising on that sort of programming. These are all decisions that if you asked us, we'd be able to explain to you. And again, we spend a lot of money advertising our own products. And so it's confusing to me why companies that are far larger than ours and have a much larger budget shouldn't actually say that sort of stuff, except that I think they are afraid of even articulating this stuff. And that goes to a deeper problem that you're mentioning, which is not really with the advertising community or with the business community per se. It's a problem with American politics generally and the body politic in specific. And what that means is that, one of the big problems, and I think this is an extension of it, is if I have somebody liberal on my show, my audience doesn't care. They're fine with that. They typically are good with that. They're happy to have that conversation. If people on the left have me on their show, they have to face tremendous censorious blowback from their own people. And that is a much larger problem that I think needs to stop in the country. I actually do think it's alleviating a little bit. I think there's a bit of a cycle where there's a small group of people in the body politic who are incredibly censorious. I think they have an outsized loudspeaker. I think that has an outsized impact on a small group of companies. That then grows into a larger group of companies who then reinforce that sort of perception with the public, and you get this sort of vicious cycle. But I think that's now being broken. One of the things that's happening with the re-election of President Trump and corporations actually doing the reverse of what they were doing before is they are pretty clearly and obviously opening up the Overton window in a lot of ways. And I think there are going to be a lot of Americans who say, okay, well, you know what? If like Facebook is allowing this stuff, does that mean that it's really that crazy? Maybe it's not that crazy, or maybe even if I think it's crazy, it's still okay to have a conversation with that person.
Well, and I guess I feel like this is where I disagree with everybody, because I agree with so much that advertisers generally have been behaving out of fear, and I can understand why. If you've got 10 layers of management between you and the CEO, why absorb risk if you're going to get called into the principal's office, right? And unfortunately, that's been driving the monetization practices behind some of the most important conversations, existential conversations, democracy conversations that actually are getting defunded through guilt by association. And during the pandemic, I think we saw this excess at its peak. I think I agree with you, it's subsiding. But my concern is that it's just reaction, 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 and we never actually come to sensible conclusions. So you and I were both at the IAB event in, I believe, May. And you made a case there for kind of an equal opportunity expansion. I want to give you a platform to make that case here. Because I think it's important and I think there's a lot of merit to it. But I make a different point. I'm glad that GARM is gone. But what's interesting is not having an ideological bent driving this. Previously, I actually thought originally GARM was a good idea because I felt that we needed some sort of metric system. GARM wasn't a third party that was chasing around advertisers going, oh, look at this, look at this. They created a framework. And I think the concept of having a framework, being able to say, well, you're going to be exposed to these levels of risk if you enter these environments is a good idea in theory. But from actually working in the trenches in it, it was very, very difficult to impose in practice, right? And that's where, like, we saw, if we actually ran a study that took the GARM framework and said, if you have a low risk tolerance, you would actually be precluded from advertising in 2/3 of the top 50 podcasts because the thing was so sensitive. You couldn't calibrate it, you couldn't execute it, but it's actually screwing people on both sides of the aisle. And I think you were part of the congressional hearings. I think there was a lot of talk about anti-conservative bias, and I'm not saying that wasn't present or part of the DNA of the people that started the thing, but in principle, I agree with the idea that we need some way to be able to make an advertiser aware of what they're going into. But this is why we've been pushing the civility score, right? And we've talked about that. In my view, you're never going to get people to agree on fact checking and misinformation. That's a non-starter. And everything that you try to do within a framework that is like GARM 2.0 is going to fail because it's going to pull towards keywords and say, well, you said Israel. Oh, you said Trump, and then you can't be there, and that's ridiculous and bad for democracy. We know that. But I do think there's a polarization issue here. And I do think the polarization is bad for business. And I do think it's not that disagreement is bad, but it's the negative nature of it where we have started defining people that disagree with one point of view as being bad or evil because they have a different point of view. Do you not see that as a fundamental challenge just in our country and for a democracy?
No, so I certainly see that as a fundamental challenge. I mean, this is a problem that the philosopher Alistair McIntyre called the motivism, this attempt to attribute to evil motivation anything that you don't like. So somebody has a different policy prescription than you. It's not because they're wrong or misinformed or because they have a different set of priors. It's because they're evil and they actually want to actively harm you. If you think that about the people that you're talking about, you can't have a conversation with those people, and you wouldn't want to hear somebody advertise on a program where you believe the person was malicious and wanted to harm you. I think that when it comes to civility, again, the devil's always in the details with this sort of stuff. And
right.
what you see with any set and any framework, and this is my lawyer side coming in, any framework, any regulatory framework that you design, people adjust their behavior to meet the regulatory framework. So let's say that you are going to set up a civility score that's rooted in not saying the word idiot or moron, right? It's sort of charged language about the stupidity of your opponent. Okay, well, I could easily change any show that proposes truly horrifying ideas just to not say those words, right? People know how to do this. People are not stupid. If they realize they can still access the advertising pool by advocating Nazi ideas, just using not those keywords, well, then they'll probably figure it out. I mean, this is what people do. And so this is sort of one of the problems with this not being a case. I wish that I had a better answer than it needs to be case by case, except I'm not sure that framework exists. So you've seen this actually in action in the differences between, say, the sort of generalized policies of a Facebook or a YouTube and the very specific kind of Elon Musk just decided one day to do a thing on X. And it's easy to say, well, Facebook is at least they're trying a broad framework, or YouTube's trying a broad framework. And look at Elon. Elon's just over there, and if he doesn't like something, then he dings it, and if he does like something, then he upgrades it, and all that. The reality is, I think that YouTube and Facebook are actually in many ways worse because the unintended consequences of incredibly complex systems are much broader than just Elon sitting there like a cotty under a tree and making individualized judgments. I think that the people in the back room at YouTube and Facebook are making those individualized judgments. I think that they're just presetting them in the algorithms. And I think that that's actually what Zuckerberg is basically now getting away from. I think Zuckerberg admitted as much. He basically said, we changed all of our algorithms to achieve these particular goals. And then everybody sort of blamed the algorithms. Well, I mean, no, there was a policymaker who decided what the presets were, and that set all the regulatory framework, and then everybody adjusted to the regulatory framework. And so whenever you get into, okay, how do you define, like what the nitty gritty? We all agree there should be some principle that is generally agreed upon. There are two ways to do it. One is to try and set, here are the things that we think are going to drive people away. It's incivility. It's people saying mean things about each other. And again, there's play in those joints because it's easy to say that, a point that I make politically about, say, transgenderism in sports. That violates the civility score depending on what pronouns I use. I mean, right? You can easily see how that could be gamed. But beyond that, one of the big problems that you have is that the minute that you sort of reduce anything down to the sort of linguistic cues, I think that you're missing the broader issue, which is every company should be able to either determine by one metric or another what they're doing. So is the metric success? And by success, I mean marketing success, your company's doing well, and also receiving less blowback to your brand, right? Less brand damage. Or the metric could be your own political persuasion, and you decide what you are comfortable advertising on and what you're not. The first metric, which is basically, let's actively see, like this is something I'd be interested in. Let's actively see what is the actual level of damage to a brand, which you can assess over time from advertising on a political show. Not some sort of like BSE, insurance adjuster, or what possibly could happen in the future, but like, let's say you advertise on Joe Rogan. How many advertisers on Joe Rogan have had serious damage to their brand? You could probably tell by the amount of revenue that they've gained or lost, or how many customers or subscribers they've gained or lost. And one of the things I think advertisers will find out very quickly is that people don't watch this stuff all that closely, right? That I've yet to see an advertiser who is so hard hit by advertising on any show, literally any show, that it's made a significant revenue dent in their bottom line, sufficient to explain these sort of preemptive high risk maneuvers that they're making, putting in, pulling out, all the rest of this. And it's almost always a lot of sound and fury. It's one of the reasons why, I mean, as you know, Dan, because we work together, that when it comes to, advertisers, one of the things we say to our advertisers, listen, you don't have to advertise with us, but if you are going to pull out, you don't get to like rip us on the way out. And also you should have a conversation with us before you leave, so we can explain to you that you need a cooling off period. Because the immediate response to anybody to criticism is to think that the rest of the world is about to cave in on them. And in reality, it's usually like 10 guys who astroturfed 50 phone calls, and you have 100,000 customers. Like the notion that that's going to, like, I've yet to see, like, please, I can't even name, like, really, off the top of my head, I cannot name a single advertiser who's been so brand damaged by appearing on a show that it was like a massive issue for their business.
I think it's generally if and when that actually happens. I think it's usually about the personal conduct off the mic. But what they say, I mean, you can probably see from your own numbers what percentage of your audience actually fundamentally disagrees with you and thinks that you're evil. Very, very low, right? So the people you're talking to are generally fine anyway. It's not actually a practical concern. But I will say this, I think most of the pressure that we've experienced as being middlemen in this whole equation is that a lot of it's personnel driven. A lot of it's people complaining internally that they feel that their values are being trampled on. The arguments that they don't feel safe, I think, are quickly dying down. But truly, as somebody that runs a business that really tries to lean on our values and practice what we preach, we want to make sure that when we conduct business, we're doing it in a way that supports the types of conversations that falls within our framework. But even still, that we don't even judge that for where we place our advertisers. I don't think that's our business. Our business is to decide, do we agree with the values of the advertiser? That's our fiduciary duty. And if we do, we interpret that as best we can. The problem is that they haven't really had anything sane to do it with. So I'm going to make last pitch for Civility Score because I want to invite you to embrace it more. Because truly, I do think ad hominem attack is measurable. I think AI can do that right now. I think it's fair. And listen, you're always going to have people gaming the system, 100%. That doesn't mean that you don't have anything that can surface something. But what's important about the Civility Score is it's not about the nouns. It's not about the subjects. It's not about what your opinion is. The thing is blind to what your political interpretation is of something. So you actually have an even playing field. And we've actually seen it bear out pretty successfully on balance. There's always nuanced problems. But generally speaking, it's nice to have a golden rule metric because ultimately, I think where the real problem comes for a brand is when you've got somebody that says, if you say Democrats are wrong, that's one thing. If you say Democrats are stupid, that's another thing. And as soon as you say that they're stupid, you just threw a rock, and they're going to throw a rock back. It's going to provoke a counterattack, and the advertiser's the one that's going to get hit in the middle. And the more that we can bring consciousness to that issue, and you can actually measure and see how you're performing in that way, you might consider using the word wrong instead of stupid. And I actually think that makes for a less reactive, lower outrage industrial complex. I think it creates a better ecosystem that's safer for brands and safer for democracy.
So, I mean, I agree in part and I disagree in part. So obviously I agree that the over application of the term stupid to describe people is a problem. Also, sometimes people are stupid, and you know, and as a host, I reserve the right to say that I think that a person is stupid when the things that they say are consistently stupid. And by the way, I think sometimes that's important because one of the things I try to do on the show is distinguish between whether I think a Democrat is wrong or whether a Democrat is stupid. Like, they're very intelligent people who are in the Democratic Party who I think are just wrong on things, and then there are people who I think are actually quite bad representatives of the Democratic Party message. And they're not just wrong; they're foolishly wrong. And I think that sometimes that's actually an appropriate modifier to describe what's going on. Also, I do wonder exactly how you do it, even using AI. Does it distinguish between saying that a democratic idea is stupid, or if I say that
Yes.
what if the person just said, if I say what you just said is a stupid thing to say?
Yes.
Does it distinguish between that and saying that the person is stupid?
Yes, it does distinguish from that. And that's not to say that AI isn't getting even better and more precise, and obviously there's going to be problems. But I do think there's a big difference in that, and saying that somebody is misguided or inarticulate, or, you know, when you're precise with your language, I think you can make the same case. It's just maybe not as interesting, but it's going to be less provocative in a way that provokes the other side to overreact when they regain power, and we just keep getting caught in the cycles that we're in. And I think overall, I think it's more sustainable for the kind of ecosystem that we're all trying to protect and preserve.
Okay, I mean, I'll hear the argument, but again, I reserve the right to suggest that I think that particular people are indeed fools or idiots or stupid or morons.
Fair, of course. Well, I'm not going to tell you how to. Well, and listen, it's not my business to tell you how you should talk about people, but it's my business to help the advertising community know what they're exposing themselves to, so they can accurately assess the risk.
I'll make the quick counter case that I'll make is maybe everybody should just loosen up a little bit. And it turns out that if you call Donald Trump stupid, you shouldn't lose your advertisers for that. And if I say that Joe Biden's a moron, I shouldn't lose my advertisers for that.
Yeah, well, and the bar goes up when it's a public figure at that level, right? Of course. The one thing I do want to say that's really positive, I got into this business. You see the LA traffic behind me. I know you left a long time ago, and I get it. But I came into this business 20 years ago because I was stuck in LA traffic and I got sick of the same songs on the radio, and I hit the AM dial and I heard debate and I heard discussion. And then when you and I started talking, I think we saw an opportunity to make it a lot more expansive in what kinds of topics were worth covering. And, you know, I think we kind of ushered in a resurgence, not a political position as much as just allowing for the free and open exchange of ideas in ways that weren't possible when you were limited by the FCC, right? And the beautiful thing about what we do is that we can facilitate that. And I never hear it. You know, you always get people sticking to talking points and not actually being intellectually honest. But the best podcast I have heard in the last 20 years was you, Sam Harris, and Barry Weiss. And to me, that is the model. You were civil, you were respectful, you differentiated, and you actually got to debate the merits of your ideas. Your ideas actually won in America, but they were given light. You were given a place to do that. And I think what I, you know, on a personal note, and also on behalf of the advertising community, because I think it helps them make more money, is I think we need to encourage and foster more of that type of discussion. So how do we facilitate that?
Well, I mean, in terms of facilitating that, again, I think that comes down to the lack of censoriousness around reaction to association, right? I mean, we talked about this in the very beginning. My advertisers are generally not going to be unhappy if I talk to Sam Harris. I'm not going to get blowback from them. I'm not going to get blowback from my audience. It's much more of a risk for Sam to get on the air with me, because there's always the possibility that his audience is going to be angry with him for having had a conversation across the aisle. And I mean, this is not, you know, sort of a one-off. I remember that I had a conversation a few years back, this is 2018, with one of the biggest left-wing talk show hosts that there is, one of the biggest podcasts that there is. And we know each other a little bit, and we happened to be at the same event. And I said to him, you know, we really should do a crossover election episode. This is during the midterms of 2018. It'll do huge business. You've got like the biggest left-wing podcast. I've got the biggest conservative podcast, and people will love it. And he said, your people will love it. My people will kill me. And that to me is the essence of the problem. Now, I'm not saying that it doesn't exist on the right. There's some of it on the right as well. I mean, there are certainly some people who will get very, very uptight if you have a civil conversation with somebody who disagrees on a key issue. But I think that, you know, that day feels like it's ending. a little bit. I think even on the left, it's starting to end a little bit. I think there's a reason that
for the next 24 months. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. For the next 24 months. And I think that this is the thing that I want to see from both advertisers and other hosts and also from the political community and the people in social media, which is, will you commit to not making the mistake that you just made? Right? What Mark Zuckerberg is doing at Facebook, I think, is terrific. And I want to make sure that it lasts beyond the next 24 months. Because if it turns out that whoever's in power is just going to get to dictate the rules of the game, there are no rules of the game at that point. A double standard is no standard at all. And so if I have to build my business around the vacillating winds of censorious public opinion, that's going to be a very difficult way to build my business. It means that I sort of have to game for worst case scenario at all times rather than just allowing it to fly and having those open conversations and having fun and doing that. It's not just that people want to have serious conversations. They want to see that you're having fun. They want to see that you're actually enjoying what you do. I mean, the thing about that debate with Sam and with Barry is that we're taking it seriously, but I mean, we're not.
We're also laughing about stuff.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, it's not like we're angry at each other. Right? We're actually just sort of analyzing ideas, and every so often he'll say something, and I'll laugh, and I'll say, well, I don't think that's true, or I think you're exaggerating, and he'll say the same thing. And if I make a joke about Biden, he'll laugh, and if he makes a joke about Trump, I'll like that kind of good-natured political debate, I think, is actually in a way coming back. And obviously, Joe Rogan has led the way on a lot of this stuff, but you're seeing it all across the board. Yeah, the thing that I think that we have to be careful to find the balance between promoting civility and inhibiting, right? Because the truth is, in freewheeling conversations, it's if you always have in the back of your mind that you're not going to speak colloquially. I mean, how do we all speak in our regular life? The thing about podcasts that makes it different, I think, than so many other forms of media, particularly TV media, where everything is kind of up in a teleprompter, right, is that when I talk to my audience, I'm talking to them the way that I would talk to you. You and I, this conversation that we're having right now is exactly the same as a conversation that we would have if there were no microphones on. Correct. There's no difference in this conversation. And the minute that you breach that, then the audience can sense it. And so, that too is a consideration.
Okay, last question on podcasting, because it's starting to change its meaning. You have the two largest distribution platforms now requiring video, and the ownership is very consolidated. What do you think the implication of that is on the channel, and what really drew us to this medium?
Well, I mean, I think that we always saw podcasting as a video-centric medium, right? The very first podcast we did was a video podcast, and the kind of generalized sense at the time was, who's going to want to watch somebody in a room talking to a microphone? People don't have the stomach for that kind of long-form content. Particularly, it's visually boring. Like if you watch an episode of Joe Rogan, it's not particularly visually interesting. But the truth is, people like watching people, and they like watching authentic people. And the more authentic the show is, the more people tend to like it. And so I think that the merger of a video is going to be actually pretty quick and pretty easy. And I think there's going to be a premium put on authenticity with regard to that sort of. I think you're going to see new formats that pop up that are particularly video friendly. I hope that it doesn't rob the medium of the sort of long form content joy that it is. I could easily see that, because the way that we consume information visually is very different than the way that we consume information in terms of just listening to it. And you could easily see the sort of thing that happened with, for example, movies, where movies used to be in the early days literally just a film of a stage show, and then it turned into McG quick cuts, right? And everybody, sort of being brain rigged and brain rewired to want the fast content very, very fast. You could see something like that happening if people consume podcasting not in an audio way, but consume it purely in a video way. I'm hoping that's not the case, and that the counter programming kind of long form stuff continues.
That's a separate conversation that I'd love to have with you one day, Ben. I know you're short on time, so I just want to say thank you for making time to have this conversation. We do a lot of business together, and I hope that continues, and I hope you keep pushing towards civility and more of the Sam Harris type discussions, because I think it's good for everybody. So thank you for your generosity, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Dan.
Well, thank you to Ben and the Daily Wire for helping us get this together. And thank you for taking the time to listen. This podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road and Veritone One, where we want you to succeed in audio and in creator-based media, and to use your influence for good. As members of the marketing community, we have the power to advance voices that don't just entertain, but edify, and to build bridges across differences and preserve fair-minded discussion around the most important topics of our age. If you're a marketer and you're looking to align your brand values with extraordinary business outcomes, reach out to our agency. You can start by going to oxfordroad.com and make sure you subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. We'd love to hear from you if you have feedback, if you love the conversation, if there's things you think we can do to add more value to this community. Please don't hesitate to contact us. info@mediaroundtable.com. Also, don't forget to listen to Ad Infinitum. That is our audio creative focused podcast. If you really want to get in the weeds, there's no better place to go. Hosted by the great Stu Redwine, VP of Creative Services here. Special thanks to Haley, Ruby, Bianca, Kyle, Ezra, Mary Jane, Everett, Neil, and the team at Podcast One. As always, influence responsibly.